tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. All right, so in the last couple of yesterday, I think, a question came in from one of our Sangha members in the Facebook group, and I'm going to paraphrase it and I'll talk about it a little bit. You can go read the original question there, and I wrote about it today as a kind of preface for this a bit. The gist of the question, in a way, comes down to how should we live our life, particularly as lay people. And the sense in the question that I heard was around how we hold these fairly austere instructions that this layer of the Buddhist tradition offers, really going back to really the basics of the Four Noble Truths, that there is all of these aspects of living experience that are in certain ways frustrating, unsatisfying, difficult, hard to bear. And that the thing that really makes them hard to bear is not their physical painfulness necessarily only, but is really the mental or mental emotional aspect of craving, attachment, holding on, fixation in the heart and mind. And so the question coming forward, how do we square, how do we create a life, not as a monastic, really as a lay person, so, embedded in the world of money and commerce and relationship and perhaps sexuality, perhaps family, all kinds of engagement, really, that feel deeply interwoven with the way that our bodies and hearts and minds move energies like wanting and desire and ambition and creativity and in the world. How should we think about, really respecting this beautiful and, this teaching that can really sound correct or true, that it's craving and attachment, fixation and wanting that causes suffering. How do we square that with really living in the fullness of making a life? So I want to reflect on this a little bit. And in a way, to do this, we've been talking about emptiness and sort of philosophies of language the last several weeks. So this is a tiny bit of a left turn. I'm going to propose that it's not that much of a left turn, because in a way, the thing about emptiness is, as a philosophy, is that it points to both how interconnected, but also how much in flux or process everything is. So nothing possesses a permanent fixated meaning. Nobody possesses a permanent fixated, unmutable, always means the same thing, identity or anything like that. All of those things change. What it means to be a person changes as the culture around us changes. What it means to be a person changes. What it means even to think of ourselves as an individual with a name and a distinct set of choices in the world. Those are ideas, and those ideas, like all ideas and conceptions of ourselves, are empty. They're products of conditions. We are embedded in our cultures, in the ecosystem, in the natural world, in the human-made world, the human-made world is just our particular corner of the natural world, but it obsesses our minds, and we create meanings and stories and narratives. And the story of attachment and suffering is just another story. Like, that's also empty. Remember, the thing that emptiness points to is, in part, that when we forget the emptiness of things, or when we forget the flux or process or conditioned nature of things, we are more likely to suffer because we're more likely to fixate. We think that something means a certain thing, and then if I get it or don't, or have a certain relationship to it, I'm stuck. If something means a certain thing and then I don't, if something means happiness and I don't get it, that's liable to lead to unhappiness for me. If I recognize that that thing doesn't intrinsically mean happiness, but that it's a process, I may be able to feel differently about it. So the thing that emptiness leads to is a kind of profound equanimity, right? It levels everything out. But everything being empty and equanimity being something we develop, it doesn't actually mean that we suddenly don't have, or even more important, don't respect our desires, that we don't respect our nature as sentient beings, as sentient animals in a complex world. So here we are as if you perhaps identify with this as practitioners of the Buddha's way, at least in part, or inspired by it, who have not at this moment made the choice to become a monastic, so not renouncing commerce and primary partnership as a structure within which to live, and so being what's called lay people, we have the challenge of how to express our desire for happiness, our desire for well-being, for freedom, for ease in this life, for clarity in the heart-mind, for a sense of connection to others and an expansive sense of love and presence, and really liberation, our desire for liberation. We have the puzzle or challenge of how to express that, all of those desires in a way that is onward leading. We've come into the proximity of this Buddhist path, whatever our relationship to that, whether we're gently exploring or life devoted or anywhere in the middle, we've been drawn to this proposal that letting go of patterns of addictive mind or fixated heart, or overly solidified emotional identities and bonds, that's wise, right? That in some way is going to be helpful in being happier, being more at ease. And so I think this question comes down to aspects of how we understand renunciation, how we understand letting go. What is it to work toward lessening attachment, lessening craving, and by extension lessening suffering and dissatisfaction, while at the same time remaining committed in a healthy way to the roles that we inhabit in lay life, in non-monastic life, in life of family and business and culture and community and sexuality and money, in whatever way we all engage with those things in greater or lesser ways. How do you do that? I think, my most transparent answer to this is that I don't really know. because I have been trying to figure it out myself for a very long time. So that's the caveat. Take everything that I say henceforth with a grain of salt in relation to that. But here's one thing that I did, one way that I tried to figure this out, that some of you have been on aspects of this path. And this is that, as a young adult in my 20s, I had the privilege and not a lot of resources, but a lot of education and safety and a sense of mobility in the world. I had that privilege enough to devote myself to essentially kinds of monastic practice for a while. So I wasn't, I wasn't married or parenting early. I wasn't embedded in a job or a profession early. And so I could do a thing that when we read accounts of lay people in the Buddha's time, we don't read accounts like this, of young people like spending months and months at a time meditating in the forest and on retreat. We read about elderly lay people doing that in India at that time. But young people, generally there was much more the role of like, get educated, have a family, serve the community first. So I was doing something else. I didn't become, permanently ordained as a monk. Might have, almost did a couple times. Temporarily did once for about a 5-month retreat. But I mostly had the sense that one was going to be temporary. I didn't know how long I would stay, and I ended up having to leave earlier than I had thought. Luke's friends needed him, back in the Cloud City. My family needed me back in Livermore, same, maybe. Anyway, I was not able to lift the X-Wing fighter with my mind, needless to say, and I left anyway. So, but it was amazing to do that. And for about 20 years, more or less, maybe 15 in its fullness, I lived in a way that was not monastic, but not lay by the definitions of the early Buddhist culture. I was not making any money. I was not very often in intimate relationship. I was spending a ton of time on retreat. And so what is that? What is that for a way to live? It was wonderful training, and and it had repercussions, some of which are that when I finally went to get a job, I had much more of an entry-level kind of job than other people that were my age peers, and what minimal savings we have is less than it would be if I had gotten a job at 25 like some of my peers and worked this whole time. So what is that? What is it to make a choice that was fairly renunciate but not monastic renunciate? And then to turn toward a more vigorous kind of work and family later on. I think it's really common nowadays to choose that, at least in the kind of progressive spiritual culture I'm around. I see a lot of folks doing this, having their families later, doing work for money somewhat later. But the implications are that when you're doing that kind of thing, intensive retreat for a long time, you're a little bit in the middle of the layperson monastic model. Lay people traditionally are the ones who have to support the monastics. And so the job of a layperson actually is to make money and learn to be generous with it. And lay people practice letting go by giving away money and resources, by building monasteries and supporting monastics and supporting the poor and supporting social services and doing charity work and caring well for their employees if you have the amount of resources to have people working for you. That's the classic layperson in the Buddha's texts. So I was nowhere near that, right? I was much more like a monastic. I got piles of scholarship from all of the meditation centers I did retreats at. And then I went to Asia and practiced essentially for free in Asian monasteries, supported by Thai and Burmese lay people out of their practice of generosity. So, but this is possible now. Now that the strict kinds of social roles and family roles that seem to have been more fixed in the time of the Buddha and in many cultures in the world now are not so fixed for some of us in the kind of communities we live in. And so you can do this thing that is, kind of a third way. It's neither lay nor monastic. It floats somewhere in the middle. But I think that at least for a time, and for some people for a very long time, if you don't have to care for children or elders or other folks who need resources from you, it can totally be a workable way to live. You can live like this. So one way to live that takes seriously the Buddha's instructions toward non-attachment and letting go in the material sense, material renunciation, is to renounce quite a bit, but stay a lay person, partly because for some of us, there's not a lot of opportunities to become a monastic. It's not like there's 40 monasteries in town that you could go to and have room for you and all of that. If you don't live in a Buddhist country, they're few and far between. So here's one model: is you stay a lay person, you renounce quite a bit, but you still have access to the things that lay people have access to. Maybe you get into a relationship and then you lean more into intimacy, and partnership. Maybe that turns into family and children. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you follow a line of work and that turns into more intense work, and suddenly you're, making money or making something, or moving creativity and energy through the world in a material way that you weren't before. And again, that's something that monastics don't tend to do. So there's that middle way, and maybe I'd mention it first. I don't want to call it the middle way. There's that sort of middle ground between lay and monastic. But the classic other roles, are the classic layperson role that doesn't focus as much on material renunciation, and instead it focuses on learning to be generous. That's an amount of material renunciation, but it focuses on lessening attachment, lessening craving, and having a meditation practice, like maintaining the core of practice is still in there. The Buddha encourages lay people to practice jhana, to learn to be concentrated. It's healthy for everybody. You don't need to be a monastic to cultivate deep states of meditation. But this kind of classical layperson form doesn't emphasize, radical simplicity or, living in a really sort of bohemian poverty. People would come to the Buddha and they would say, Blessed One, we are lay people. We enjoy sensual pleasures. We enjoy fine silks from Benares and fine foods and, and wonderful music. And the Buddha says, that's great. And, here's the teachings on generosity and on keeping the precepts and, on what actions lead to beneficial futures. The teaching on the Four Noble Truths, that grasping is the prime cause of suffering and distress. In some of the descriptions of the gradual path, that teaching is not given first. The first teachings are teachings on generosity, teachings on the 5 precepts, teachings on loving kindness, and on actions that lead to rebirth in the heaven realms, and that's generosity, kindness, compassion, the Brahma Viharas. Brahma Vihara means heaven realm in a way. So, the Buddha will give these teachings to someone, a lay person, and then only when the Buddha would discern that their mind was ready and available for a deeper truth and malleable, would he then give the teaching the teaching that is unique to the Buddhas, it's called, which is the Four Noble Truths. And often when the Buddha gives that, then their heart or their mind, instead of becoming, satisfied and just a lay devotee and they go for refuge, when the Buddha gives the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, they can have an opening of the Dharma eye. They can open into being a stream enterer. And so their practice really, expands. And when people in the texts attain stream entry, lay people, sometimes they remain lay people and, they become deeply grateful, devoted. They serve the Buddha and the monastics generously. And other times they're so inspired that they want to immediately go forth and ordain as monastics. So you can take either path. But in a way, because mindfulness and meditation were brought kind of as their own thing to the West, in the context of Buddhism and the Dharma, but the fully devotional parts and some of the other teachings that the Buddha gave were not emphasized when the Dharma came here. I know far more. This is true. I'll just speak of my lineage, the insight meditation lineage, but I think it's also partly true in Zen, somewhat differently in the Tibetan systems. But a huge number of people that I know in all of those main lineages that came to the West are really consider themselves, really are practitioners, we would say, are really practicing meditation and studying deep Dharma with the intention to really progress on the path, to really know something about themselves and to deepen in liberation of some kind. I hardly ever hear anyone say, I'm just trying to do good and keep the precepts and generate good karma so I'm reborn in a better place. Like, that's a very classical layperson goal that didn't really translate into Western culture. And so I know a lot of people in this middle ground social role, folks who are trying to be successful lay people, but also really sincere Dharma practitioners. And that creates tension, because there can be an impulse towards simplicity and calm and letting go. And then you got to get back to work and earn money for the family and pay the exorbitant rent that you have to pay. And because the non-dual systems have been so inspiring for so many people, there's often the sense that that renunciation of sensual pleasures, loving wonderful food, loving to go to a good party. I went to a very good party this past weekend. So here is someone who loves sensual pleasures. It's true. But there's a dissonance between the recognition that letting go and calm and tranquility and clarity of the mind and simplicity really are deeply peaceful and easeful. Like, that's just clear. Once you hang out in those states for a while, you get it, that those are really a nice place to hang out. And then you can change channels and be like, well, yeah, and like dinner at a nice restaurant and a good show and being with my sweetheart and just like, let's just roll in some more expansive sensory pleasures, can also be very desirable, very beautiful. And so I think it really can feel like those things, maybe they're just different channels in your life. For a long time for me, they just lived in different places in me. I would go and do a whole bunch of intensive retreat, and then I would come back and I would be in the dance and performance art world in San Francisco, which was a fairly extraordinary hedonistic world. Along with being, it had its own monastic type element. Certainly the poverty element was foreground, but it was really engaged in the sensory, So there's the classic layperson instructions, which are not about renouncing sensory pleasures, not about renouncing engagement, they are about cultivating virtue and abundance and these core qualities of generosity and compassion and loving kindness that you then use in service of others. I think the heart of the classic layperson social role is to move resources around in the world in service of well-being. And so becoming wealthy actually is helpful for that if you have the wherewithal. So then there's this middle ground where you're super into intensive practice and you actually like radical simplicity. That's going to have some implications, which are going to be renunciate. It's going to be harder to, have family and big career and a bunch of other things. And then I haven't said anything about it because no one here is doing this right now. But of course, then there's the monastic vocation, which is a way to live deeply devoted to practice, but also just deeply devoted to these core qualities of simplicity, peacefulness, ease, settledness, calm in the nervous system. Maybe it's helpful, I think, not to think of monasticism as an otherworldly, radically different path, but to think of it as, it's a way to live in an intentional community of people who share your values and who will care for you forever, materially and spiritually. And I'm really going to speak here only to healthy monastic communities because, of course, there are unhealthy ones. And I just want to point to the archetype of the monastic role. And there are many healthy monastic communities that can be joined. So I'm going to speak to the best of that model. The trade-off, right, is that you in a formal way set aside you close the door on commercial ambition and money making. You close the door on sexuality being expressed physically, and like marriage and family and children, right? And in exchange for setting those particular things down that are so those are really the engine of our entanglement. And I don't say that in a negative way. They're the engine of engagement with the world, is that you're connected to people and you move money around. And money also means, art and creativity and culture and all the rest. But, monastics can be creative. Monastics write and do many things, And there's some that they set aside, they don't do other things that are creative, that are, more sensual, like play the cello or, write emo songs about what's happening in their practice. Some of them write pretty emo poems, though, about what's happening in their practice, let me tell you. But that's a third way, and it's not necessarily as radical as it seems, but it is a way to, and you can do it temporarily. It is a way to make the gesture of turning toward the happiness of radical simplicity and communal life and living in a collective format, and really setting down the stress of the material world, of the consumer world, and so yeah. So in terms of this question, the monastic lifestyle is the primary answer the Buddha would often give. How do you really reckon with craving and attachment? And he said, well, the easiest way to deal with that is to set a lot of things down and then be really supported to let your mind rest, let your heart rest in the safe haven and in the refuge, of a good place, the Sangha being the good place, the very good place. So whichever of these three kind of large archetypal or streams of life we choose, you always have to deal with the reality that craving and attachment can give rise to fixated, addictive states of mind, and that hurts. That's just painful. And then there's these different strategies for how to learn to unbind that painful pattern. And you can unbind it through letting go of a lot of things, through letting go of some things, or letting go of not that much. But then you have to figure out, in the full layperson's lifestyle, saturated sensual pleasures, you have to figure out how to work on craving and attachment if you still want a lot of things. And so that's practice. And there's practice there just as much as anywhere. All right. So there's a bit on that. I hope it speaks a bit to the question that came in, and yeah, and just opens us into just a consideration in a very practical, really in a very material way of how we express our practice in our lives right now. So thanks for listening.